Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two terms many people know about but struggle to live out. And today, as we study Genesis 40 to 45 in the life of Joseph, we'll see what it looks like to truly forgive and reconcile. Now, today we're finishing out our quick water ski through the life of Joseph that we began yesterday. There is so much great material in the record of Joseph's life. Moses wrote this account around 1446 BC or so, and he wrote the book of Genesis for the children of Israel who had been delivered from Egypt. And this account explains to them that they were the chosen people of God, whom God had sent to Egypt for protection and provision, and Joseph's life illustrates for them that even though they were formerly slaves, like Joseph, they would rise above their past to fulfill the divine purposes ordained by God. And so the life of Joseph is a vital link in the unfolding of God's plan for his people. Now, yesterday we saw that Joseph's brothers were bitter because of the special treatment he received from Jacob, their father. And because they were so bitter, they sold him into slavery and shipped him off to Egypt. In Egypt, he was bought by a man named Potiphar. Joseph flourished in Potiphar's house and was placed in charge over all that Potiphar had. But during that time, Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. Joseph was faithful to the Lord and resisted her advances, and when she saw he would not give in, she tried to destroy him and claimed he attacked her. Now, such an attack would have meant death, but Joseph had found favor with Potiphar, and Potiphar did not kill Joseph, but instead threw him into prison. Now, we didn't cover this yesterday, but if you want to read chapters 40 and 41, you'll find out that in prison, Joseph cared for two banished officials, Pharaoh's chief baker and Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. One night, both had a dream, and the next morning, Joseph interpreted their dreams. He said that the cupbearer would be restored to Pharaoh's side, but the chief baker would be executed. Both interpretations came true. The chief baker was executed, and the chief cupbearer was restored to Pharaoh's side. But unfortunately, that didn't result in Joseph's deliverance from prison, and a couple years went by. He was still holed up in jail, and then one night, Pharaoh had a set of unnerving dreams, and his magicians couldn't interpret them. And then the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and advised Pharaoh to begin a policy of taxation for the next 7 years so that they could store enough grain to last through the 7-year famine that was about to come. Now Pharaoh saw Joseph's wisdom and appointed him over this task. And in that role, Joseph amassed more grain than could be counted. He ruled over Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. And so that's the cliff notes that now brings us to today's material. Chapter 42 opens 20 years after Joseph was first sold into slavery. For 13 years, Joseph was a slave, but in chapter 41, God vindicates Joseph's faithfulness, and he has now ruled Egypt for 7 or 8 years. And at this point in chapter 42, Jacob and his family are in a desperate situation. There's a famine going on, and they're out of food, and they don't know it, but there are at least 5 more years to go in this famine. Now, many of us remember the horrible Ethiopian famines of the 1980s. That famine lasted from 1983 to 1985, only 2 years, and it was Ethiopia's worst famine in a century. And yet this was a 7-year famine, and Jacob's family was caught up in it, and they were facing annihilation. Now, Jacob realizes the solution's in Egypt because they got food, so he sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain. But he does not send Benjamin with them because he doesn't want anything bad to happen to him. And so when Jacob's sons arrive in Egypt, they're brought before Joseph, but they don't recognize him. And in verse 6, they bow before the very person they mocked 20 years earlier for having dreams about these kinds of things. And yet here they are bowing to him. And they're also going to bow before him in chapter 44, verse 11, and chapter 50, verse 18. 3 times Joseph's prophetic dreams that we saw yesterday have been fulfilled. Now, for the next couple minutes, we're going to talk about a sequence of events that might seem harsh. But we need to remember that we're actually seeing Joseph working through whether or not he could actually trust his brothers. After all, they were the ones who sold him to slavery. So we need to remember that what we're going to be reading here in Joseph's response is actually showing us he's already forgiven his brothers. If you think about it, in chapter 40, Pharaoh executed his chief baker on a whim. Joseph is now second in command. He would have no trouble indicting and convicting his brothers of real treachery. He could have had his brothers executed tomorrow. And the fact that he does not shows his heart of compassion and forgiveness. And this is an important principle. Forgiveness is when we do not require someone to repay us for what they owe us. If you borrow my motorcycle and you smash it on up, I might be like, well, that's going to be a couple $1,000. Now, if you pay me a couple $1,000 and I shake your hand and we're all good and the relationship is restored, that may all look good, but I've actually not forgiven you. I've required you to pay something for our relationship to be restored. But if I say, don't worry about paying me back, I'll just absorb that loss. Now that's forgiveness. Forgiveness usually costs us more than it costs the other person. And if we're not willing to absorb that cost, that pain, that hurt, well, we're probably not forgiving them. And that's why true forgiveness requires God's love. Our ability to forgive someone comes from being filled with God's love, and His love enables us to do what would otherwise be impossible. But when we're in fellowship with God, His love flows in our hearts, and His love enables us to endure the personal loss that forgiveness requires. Now, sometimes people don't want to forgive because they think they don't like the consequences. They'll have this wrong understanding, like maybe if someone crashes my motorcycle, I've got to forgive them, but I don't want to because that means the next time they got to ride my bike, and if they crash my next bike, I'll have to forgive them again, and then let them ride my next bike, and they can crash that bike too. And that's how people view forgiveness. But they're confusing forgiveness with reconciliation. Forgiveness extends mercy and grace without repayment. Reconciliation is when we agree to the terms of the relationship. And so being reconciled means to be reconciled. To be conciled with someone means to be conciliatory, to be on friendly terms with them. It requires a change to happen so that we're now on friendly terms. I can forgive someone for crashing my bike and not require they pay me back, but before they ride my next bike, we're going to have a conversation about their riding skills. When we're reconciled, we're agreeing to this path going forward. Maybe they'll drive slower, maybe they'll stay off dirt roads, maybe they'll take a rider safety course. We agree to the changes and how this relationship is going to be going forward. Now, here's what we need to understand. Several passages command us to forgive everyone. Matthew 6:15 says, "But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions." And so we're commanded to forgive everyone because that's in our power. But we're also commanded to have an attitude of reconciliation towards everyone. Romans 12:18 says, "If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men." And so God commands us to forgive everyone because that's in our power. He commands us to seek to be at peace with everyone because it may not be in our power to reconcile with every single person, but we still should have this attitude. As far as it depends on us, we should be able to reconcile with everyone. And so as we go through these passages here, we're going to see that Joseph demonstrates both of these attitudes. Chapters 42 to 45 show us Joseph's work in reconciliation with his brothers. He's already forgiven them, but the back and forth we're about to see is not because he's giving them a bunch of hoops to jump through before he forgives them or reconciles with them. He is determining their character and if they're ready to reconcile. Now think about the difficulty of this situation. Over 20 years have passed. Now he's ruler of Egypt. The responsibility of the nation rests on his shoulders. He cannot afford to jeopardize his authority and responsibility to save the people of Egypt. And so now the terms of the relationship have changed. Will they change too? Now, if they haven't changed, they can get their grain and go. But if they have changed, and if they're willing to reconcile, they will experience blessings they could have never imagined. But first, Joseph must determine the condition of their heart. So let's skim Genesis 42 to 45 to see how Joseph determines their readiness to reconcile. Now, this process begins in Genesis 42 verse 9 when Joseph calls his brothers spies. Now, his brothers deny this charge. They say in verse 13, "Your servants are 12 brothers in all." Now, it's obvious that 12 brothers are not standing before him. So he says in verse 15, "By this you'll be tested." And he tells them he's going to hold them in prison. 9 brothers will stay in prison. 1 will go back and get Benjamin. Now, this is their first test of character, and they don't pass. For whatever reason, they don't trust each other. And in verse 17, 3 days goes by with them stuck in prison, and they can't agree on who's going to stay and who's going to go. And so after 3 days, it's clear they have failed the test. Now, lots of people in Joseph's shoes would have said, well, they failed the test. That's it. We're done here. But not Joseph. Joseph truly desires reconciliation, and so he modifies his plan. In verses 18 and 19, Joseph brings them back and he says, "I fear God," as in, I too am a follower of Yahweh the Lord. I can be trusted. And so if you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay. And so he's gone from 9 now to 1. Let him stay, be confined to prison, and the rest of you go back home and bring your other brother back. Now this seems reasonable, but they still don't trust one another, and they can't decide who's going to stay. And so in verse 24, Joseph just chooses Simeon and sends the rest on their way. And so this is not the most auspicious beginning for reconciliation. But even in this passage, there is a glimmer of character development in verse 21. In verse 21, the brothers say to one another, "Truly, we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he was pleading with us, and yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us." And so for the first time, the brothers' guilty consciences show that reconciliation may be possible. Well, skipping down to the end of chapter 43, they return to Jacob and explain the situation to him, and this is another test they fail, and Jacob fails it too. Jacob says to them in verse 36, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin? All of these things are against me." Basically, I've already lost Joseph. I'm not willing to lose Benjamin. And notice what he's saying. He's saying, Simeon will rot in jail before I send Benjamin over to Egypt. And so in verse 37, Reuben responds by saying, if we don't come back, you can kill my 2 boys. Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous idea, and Joseph doesn't jump at the idea of killing his grandson, so he's basically like, yeah, no. Now, imagine how painful this would have sounded, though, to everybody else. He's basically saying, I know I've got 10 of you, but you guys don't count. The only son that matters to me is Benjamin. And so this is a problem at every level, and because there's no change, reconciliation is delayed. And that takes us then to chapter 43. In chapter 43, verse 2, their food runs out, and now things are serious. All of their lives are being threatened, they're all on the verge of dying, and Jacob realizes he's going to lose Benjamin to starvation anyway, and so he agrees to let him go to Egypt. Now this time, when they come before Joseph in Egypt, in chapter 43, verse 16, Joseph sees Benjamin, and now he sends them all to his own house. Now this must have seemed so bizarre, but they've got no choice, so they gotta go. And when they're at his house, he assigns their seats according to their birth order. That's amazing right there. And to make things even stranger, in verse 34, Joseph then gets up from his own table and walks to their table and gives them some of his own food. But he doesn't give them all the same amount. He gives Benjamin 5 times as much as everyone else. And this is another test. Are they still bitter about the favoritism shown by Jacob? Were they going to be bitter over Benjamin's privileges? And if they are bitter over Benjamin, they're probably still bitter over Joseph as well. But this time, things are looking better. And in verse 34, it says, they feasted and drank freely. There is no sign of bitterness. They're simply accepting Benjamin's blessings. And this is definitely an improvement, but the situation still needs to be laid out plainly. And so to kind of break things out in the open, in chapter 44, verse 2, Joseph has his own silver cup put in Benjamin's sack. The plan is that Benjamin will be accused of theft and be arrested. And if they're okay with Benjamin getting carted off to an Egyptian jail, and if they're relieved that the last of Jacob's favorite sons is now gone, Joseph would know their heart has not changed, and Ben would still be with him, and they would just live out their days in Egypt in this privileged state of royalty. But if they stood up for Benjamin and refused to let him go, then Joseph would know that they were new men, and he could be reconciled with them. And so the brothers head off, and in verse 4, Joseph sends a servant after them and accuses Benjamin of stealing a silver cup. Again, on the surface, Benjamin is guilty, will have to stay in Egypt. But here's where we see their change of the heart. In verse 18, Judah falls before Joseph and gives one of the longest and most emotional pleas for mercy in the Bible. In verse 18, he acknowledges that Joseph is equal to Pharaoh. In verse 30, he explains that his father's life is bound up with Benjamin's life. And so in verse 33, Judah begs that he be allowed to become Joseph's slave so that Benjamin could go home. And they had a chance to get rid of Jacob's favorite son, but instead they beg for his release and even ask to be enslaved instead of him. And so finally it is clear, these are changed men. And that brings us to the reconciliation with Joseph in chapter 45. In chapter 45, when Joseph sees they've changed, he cries out in verse 3, I am Joseph. Now, they can't understand what's going on. It's just too much for them. And so he's like, guys, come closer. Look at me. I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now, Joseph has not forgotten what they did to them, but he has forgiven them. And we see what this looks like in verse 5 when he says to them, now, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. And in verse 7, he says, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Joseph is clearly understanding that he and his brothers have this sacred responsibility to establish this nation for God. And so he goes on to say in verse 8, now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. And so it's just this incredible story here. We can keep on going on, but let me just summarize what happens here. They hear this, they're blown away, they go back home, they get Jacob, he's blown away, and they all move back to Egypt. In chapter 47, Jacob meets Pharaoh and blesses him twice. They all move to Goshen, they live there as shepherds, and in chapter 49, Jacob blesses his sons and then passes away. And then in chapter 50, Joseph's brothers come to him again, and they're concerned that now that Jacob is gone, Joseph's really going to let him have it. And so for the third time, Joseph's brothers fall before him and fulfill the prophecies about bowing before him. But instead of condemning them, Joseph says to them in verse 19 of chapter 50, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. And so the account of Joseph and his brothers ends with them being clearly, fully reconciled. Now, I know that that's a super fast study in the life of Joseph, but Joseph's life is a wonderful record of a person who overcomes horrible adversity and even his own fears, you might say, and bitterness by the grace of God. And this shows us the kind of strength and courage and love and forgiveness that it means to be part of God's people. And so let's end our time together by asking the Lord to fill us with His grace that we might follow Joseph's example and be people of love and reconciliation just like him. Well, that's Joseph's life. Thanks so much for listening to today's podcast. Until tomorrow, have a great day and God bless.